Welcome to the next video in the series, and this video is going to talk about multi-criteria decision analysis, or MCDA. So MCDA is from an area of operational research called decision analysis, and I'd say that if you look at the worldwide community of operational research, you'll find that I would say decision analysis is the area of operational research which has had the most acceptance in terms of allowing subjective or softer types of operational research. And certainly in the USA, which tends to be quite resistant to softer approaches within operational research, decision analysis is very much accepted and has been a very popular area of operational research. So it certainly is a very good area of operational research to have within your toolbox. So decision analysis, as you can imagine, based on the title, is focused on decision making. So it tends to think of situations where somebody is facing a decision, and it's normally a choice between possible alternatives. And of course that scenario will crop up quite often in an operational research context. So we often find ourselves in operational research arriving at a situation where we have to choose between options. And decision analysis is well proven. It's got there's lots and lots of applications out there to look at. So the way that decision analysts tend to think is that good decision making is viewed as the desire to avoid undesirable consequences and to achieve desirable ones. So that's really their mindset. So they tend to think of things in terms of consequences or options. And the relative desirability of consequences is viewed as a concept based on values. Values being what we care about, what we think is important. And they argue they should be the driving force behind our decision making. So decision analysis, it identifies options, and that's very much an important part of the process. And then it systematically evaluates them based upon decision criteria. So I think the best way with decision analysis to get the message is to give you an example. So let's take an example. So what I'm going to do is think about a case example where we want to choose between a set of options. So let's take a fairly straightforward example, just so that we don't get lost in the details. So let's say that you were holding an annual conference next year in 2021, and you had to make the decision of where to hold that conference. So a relatively straightforward decision, but it's still a decision which involves a number of decision criteria. So let's say we've got four options. So the next step is to think about what criteria might be important in making this type of decision. And this is going to be a process which is essentially, to some extent, brainstorming. Of course, it might be something that you could do some rich picturing on first, and I certainly would be doing that to understand the situation which the decision making is happening within. Also, you might want to go out and talk to stakeholders. You might want to interview stakeholders about their views, about their values, and all of that sort of qualitative data will feed into creating a list of criteria. So, for example, with the choice of hotel for our conference, criteria might be the cost of hiring the hotel, transportation links to the hotel, quality and range of conference facilities, the quality of the accommodation, the quality of catering service, staff experience and level of service, and then the availability of informal meeting places, networking places, social spaces, and then the overall feel of the general environment. So let's say we came up with that list. So the next step would be to try and score each of those criteria. So let's say when we actually looked at those criteria, we organised them into what we call level 1, level 2, because we want to actually sort of put some sort of organisation onto those criteria. So for example, the environment and the access we might want to think of as being criteria relating to location. Facilities might cover things like staff, conference rooms, meeting places, accommodation and catering. So those might be sort of in a sense criteria, sub-criteria of the facilities criteria. And then the cost. And what we need to do is we need to apply weights, value weights to each of those criteria. So level 1 criteria, they are location, facilities and cost. So we have to put some kind of a weighting on those 3 criteria: location, facilities and cost. And that's really down to the values of the people making the decision. So I've put some weights there of 0.35 for location, 0.45 for facilities, 0.2 for cost. And notice that those weights must total up to 1. Okay, so all of those weightings must add up to 1 in order to enable us to do the calculations later. Once we've got those level 1 weightings, we go into the level 2 weightings. So for location, we've got environment and access, and I've weighted those as 0.5 because to me they seem to be of equal importance or equal value. And then staff, conference rooms, meeting places, accommodation and catering have been weighted as 0.1, 0.3, 0.15, 0.2 and 0.25. And again, those level 2 weightings for facilities must total up to 1. So that's going to be obviously a discursive process. There will be different points of view. We need to allow, as with all problem structuring, we need to allow a situation where sufficient time is spent on that setting of weights if there are different points of view. And then the next thing we need to do is to actually score each of our options based upon those weights. So here we have a table which shows how each of the 4 options, A, B, C and D, score on each of those criteria. So for location, we don't score the actual options for location, we actually score the level 2 if there are more than one level 2 criteria. So what we do is we choose the option that performs the best, and we choose and we give that 100. We choose the option which has the worst performance, and we give that 0, and then we score the other 2 options relative to that. So where the worst is 0, the best is 100, where do the other 2 fit in with that? Okay, so for example, for option A, the environment is considered to be the worst, so it gets 0, and the travel excess is the best, so it scores 100. For option B, the environment is rated at 25 out of 100, and the travel excess is weighted as 80 out of 100, etc., etc. So we systematically run through all of the options and all of the weightings to score. Now notice that with cost, there is no level 2 criteria, so we just score the level 1 cost. So in this case we've got option C as being 100, which is the cheapest. Option B gets 0 as the most expensive, and then A and D are scored 5 and 60 relative to those two. Okay, now so once we've scored all of the options and against all of the criteria, we can calculate an overall score for each of the options. So I've just focused in on option A just to show you how we do that calculation. So if we remember that A scored 0 for location, 0, let's just go back. So option A scored 0 for environment and 100 for access. So it gets 0 and 100. And because each of those criteria was scored at 0.5, then it's 0 times 0.5 plus 100 times 0.5. So the overall score for location for option A is 50. Now we do the same for facilities. That's a bit of a longer calculation, and we end up with a total of 67.3. And then we don't have a level 2 score for cost because there is no level 2 criteria. And then so now we've got 50, 67, and for cost it's actually, if you remember, it was 5, and then we add those, we put those all together and introduced the level 1 weights, which were 0.35, 0.45 and 0.2, and then we calculate that and add it all up, and we end up with an overall score of 48.8. Okay, so in a sense that's scoring that particular option based upon its performance on the criteria that we've selected and the weightings that we have judged. And so it's a very systematic way of evaluating that particular option. Now, once we've got scores for all of the different options, we can start to look at the results of that scoring. So there's different ways of doing that. Obviously you can look at the raw numbers, but in my opinion it's better to look at a graphical representation. So I prefer to do that. So here we've got a graph which shows how each of the options performs on each of the level 1 criteria, so location, facilities and cost, and then we draw a line between those scores, and so we get a performance line, if you like. So if we look at option C, for example, we can see that it's performing poorly on location and facilities, but it performs highly on cost because it's very cheap. Whereas the opposite is option B, which performs well on location. It performs the best in terms of facilities, but it performs the worst in terms of cost because it's the most expensive. But we get an overall sense of performance. So if we look at them systematically, so option B with a score of 59 performs well, but it's high cost. Option A with a score of 49 has a similar cost to B, but it loses out on facilities. But it's very similar in terms of location. And then option D with a score of 54 is the good all-round choice. So it's scoring well on all of those 3 criteria. And then option C with a score of 40 is cheap, but it's performing poorly. Okay, so we get a performance evaluation for each of the options. Now, at that point, this analysis then can inform a choice of which of those 4 options we might want to go with. Now, of course, at this point, we shouldn't get too carried away with the numbers, because of course those numbers were subjectively created, and it's not unusual for people to want to go back to the original weightings and just play around with those numbers a bit, just to see if the results are sensitive. So, for example, it's a good idea to check how sensitive those results are to the various criteria. So, you might have 2 options which are quite similar to each other, but slight changes to some of the criteria actually make the results quite different. And we would want to know that, because in practice we might think, well, actually those criteria are actually really, really important to us, and actually when we look at them again we might think, actually I want to score that slightly differently. So it's absolutely right that this should be an iterative process, because what we're really trying to do is just facilitate people to think about the criteria that are relevant to a particular decision, to think about the value that they would assign to each of those criteria, and then to systematically work through what that means in terms of a decision. But of course, we should never regard the final result as being absolutely some kind of objective result which proves that one option is better than another, because we need to remember the subjectivity of the weighting process. But I think clients find this to be a very satisfyingly rational and systematic way of going about choosing between options, and I think they feel that especially in policy arenas, or in public sector arenas, or in strategic arenas where they want some sort of support for their decisions, I think it provides people with a sense of rigor, which makes decision makers feel more comfortable than if they were just saying, well, we think it's probably this is the best option. Okay, so that's multi-criteria decision analysis, MCDA. Thanks a lot.